Welcome again to another Curator's Chat. I'm Jason French, Curator of Collections at the Behringer-Crawford Museum. As you can probably tell, we're not at the Behringer-Crawford Museum. We're actually at a museum very close to us, and this is a place of stories. This is a wonderful place with thousands of stories. This is Vent Haven, and I'm here with the curator at Vent Haven, Lisa Squeaky, and she and I have been spending this morning talking about just some of the stories. And I wanted to ask Lisa, what is one of your favorite stories that's part of your collection and this wonderful treasure here?
Yeah, Vent, like you said, it is full of stories. There's no end to what we could talk about and that we have talked about since you got here this morning. So it's been a really nice time to have you here, and I appreciate you all coming out. When you asked me to pick a story that I like, my mind immediately went here to this bellhop named George. The reason I picked that one is because Mr. Berger, our founder, knew the ventriloquist who used George. His name was Norman Norton. And Norton was retiring from ventriloquism in 1953. So Mr. Berger wrote him a letter and said, "Hey, I heard you're retiring. Would you like to sell me your dummies for my collection?" And Norman wrote him back and said, No, my son's interested. My son wants to keep them since they're part of my history. And so I'm not going to sell them at this time. That was November of 1953. And Mr. Berger wrote back and said, "Well, that's fine. If you ever change your mind, you know where I am. And I hope that someday your dummies can join the Vent Haven collection." So 60 years go by. And I got an email from a nursing home in California where the patient who was living in the nursing home had passed, and they were taking care of his estate and all of his objects. He had kept the two ventriloquism dummies. This was Norman Norton's son, and he had kept the two ventriloquism dummies with him in his room at the nursing home. And in the back of this little dummy in his body, there was a little note that said, "Send me to Vent Haven Museum in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky." So it was 60 years after Mr. Berger asked for the dummy that the dummy got here. But either way it got here. And I think that is a really cool story about one of our acquisitions here at Vent Haven.
Oh, that is a wonderful story. And his name's George.
George the bellhop.
He's a great dummy. What about so Vent Haven, George is just one of the stories, and there are so many stories here. You've got wonderful performers and ventriloquists that are still involved and maybe on your board or others, and you have a yearly conference.
Our convention is always the third weekend of July every year since 1975.
That's amazing.
A couple of exceptions, including the pandemic year, of course, but it's a wonderful gathering of ventriloquists from all over the world. We have about 13 countries represented here.
And of all those wonderful different countries, different ventriloquists, different dummies, some of these dummies have lived really interesting lives. You said you've got 4 dummies that were part of a shipwreck?
Yeah, the Shipwreck Collection is really kind of cool. It was an early 20th century ventriloquist named William Wood, who was a professional ventriloquist, and his market was essentially towns on the Gulf Coast. And he would get into a boat, and he'd go to the next town and get off and do a show and get on a boat and go to the next show, and around the whole Gulf of Mexico and northern Mexico. And he was on a ship in 1908, just minding his own business, and a hurricane came up, and lightning struck the ship, and it sank. And all of his dummies were in their trunks with the luggage, so that all washed up on shore, and they were acquired by a man named Custerer, who had them for years. And most of the damage that the dummies got from that dunking in the Gulf was because they were saturated by salt water and they were never rinsed off. So when people see them, they think, oh, they must be so much older than they look. But the truth is that if he'd have just hosed them off with salt water, the damage would have been about half as much. But yeah, it's a neat collection of these guys that, couldn't swim, so someone had to go get them out of the Gulf.
So that is wild. And you also have dummies that were at the Beverly Hills Supper Club the night that it burned.
That's right. The main act that night, a lot of people know, was John Davidson, who was a very, very popular singer in the 70s and 80s, and I think even in the 60s. The opening act for John Davidson was a ventriloquist named Jim Teeter, and actually was a dual comedy team named Teeter and McDonald. They were on stage when the fire broke out, and Jim was on performing with 2 of his presidential dummies that are here at Vent Haven when the busboy came in and told them that there was a fire and they had to evacuate. So Jim was part of the of the help to get people out of the fire. And then same thing with John Davidson, of course. They would go in and out trying to get more and more people out of the fire. But that story is what brought John Davidson to the museum. He wanted to see them again after, I think it was on the 40th anniversary of the fire, so just a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got dummies that have kind of had interesting kind of tragic stories, just or been around with things. Yeah. But you also have dummies that are very old.
We do. Mm-hmm.
At least one 19th century.
Yeah, several from the 19th century, but one that we can confidently date because it was a mass-produced doll first. It was made by a German doll company, so we know there's a production stamp on it, so we're sure. But we have many dummies that would date between 1860 and 1900. But the actual production date, we have to kind of give that some leeway, a range of years to be more confident. So you've also got a lot of other media and archives. Yes.
So how many of the dummies would you say you've got recordings of the performances?
Well, that just depends on, with a lot of that, it just depends on the timeline. Obviously, with the older dummies, we have mostly paper. We have we have photos, playbills, scripts, recordings you move into. We have some recordio discs, which are really old. We've got a lot of albums and cassettes and VHS tapes, of course, too. But we do have some really nice old recordings, and many of which we did have transferred prior to the media breaking down. Right. So that was good. But yeah, the archive here, to me, is what makes this iceberg collection really worth seeing, is that people come in and they'll see hundreds and hundreds of these ventriloquism dummies, but for each one of them there's a massive file behind the scenes of the script and extra costumes, let's say, an acquisition story, performance history, just any kind of part of that dummy story is also here. So you're not just coming here and seeing something with a little card on it and then that's the end of it. Tourists can point to any of the objects and say, tell me more about this, and I have the archive here to back that up. So it's really extraordinary what Mr. Berger did in his lifetime to gain not just the piece, but the story behind the piece.
Well, and that's really special, because it's one thing to have a ventriloquist dummy that is interesting and takes a lot of craftsmanship to build, but it's also to know the story, to know the script, to understand how that dummy interacted with the ventriloquist and vice versa, and how they were entertainers together as a partnership.
Yes, definitely a comedy team.
Yes.
And that really kind of goes to Edgar Bergen's influence in ventriloquism. Prior to that, you have a lot more of the ventriloquist just basically demonstrating a skill. Look at me, I can talk without moving my mouth, and it looks like this doll is talking or whatever. Edgar Bergen came along in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s and developed this character in Charlie McCarthy. And so ventriloquism took that turn into comedy duo, and where the dummy has its own character, personality, disposition. It's going to respond to questions in its own way. And all of that investment is what makes these, this dummy, like Jeff Dunham with Walter. Yeah. You've got this finely defined person in Walter that is not Jeff. And so you're perceiving a comedy team rather than just a man or a woman with a doll.
Yeah, because Jeff Dunham has a collection here. Yeah,
Jeff Dunham's very active with the museum. He's come to every convention, I think, except one, and I think that was the year his mother made him go to a church choir tour in Europe, and he couldn't come to one of the conventions. I think that's what he said. But anyway, yeah, he's one of our biggest advocates. Of course, he loves the history of the museum, having attended all the conventions, and he knows so much. He makes his own dummies, of course, so he's very much engaged in the history of the museum as much as he is in his own career.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing with us. It's kind of a pleasure to get outside of our normal museum and get to talk about something that another museum has. It's very close. Vent Haven is an amazing place, and I certainly encourage you to come and see this museum. And I know you've got plans for expansions in the future. Yeah,
so we're open for regular tourism until August 31st. All of our tours are by appointment. You can either phone or you can go on the website and contact me about coming for a visit. August 31st, we're closing for demolition for our new facility. So if you want to see it in the original format here with the old buildings, you got to come before August 31st. And then we'll be open next year with the new building.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa. If you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and we'll see you on our next Curator's Chat.